Hello and welcome to Ask a Pastor. My name is Dan Shields. I'm part of the worship staff here at Orchard Hill Church, and I am joined by Dr. Terry Thomas from Geneva College, who is also a adjunct teacher here at Orchard Hill. Welcome, Terry.
Good to be here.
Good to see you. I'm thrilled to be able to interview you. I'm sitting in for Kurt Bjorklund today. He had to take off, so I'm taking over his spot. Normally I'm over in that seat, but today I'm over in this seat. And I'm glad to be with Dr. Terry Thomas.
Seat. Watch yourself.
It is warm still. So, I have to admit something to you, Terry. I don't know if I've ever told you this before, but my wife, a long time ago, she was, for some reason, I was thinking about a message of yours, and I was thinking about how much I appreciated it. And my wife looked at me and she said, I love you. And I looked, and I was just thinking this in my head as she said that, and I said, I love Dr. Terry Thomas. It's the truth. It's the honest truth. You can ask my wife about this. So anyhow, I'm glad to be here with Dr. Terry Thomas.
Good.
So a little awkward, but hey, so we have a question here, and this question, just to let you viewers know, it's about a page and a half long, so I'm going to sort of highlight what was said in this question. We're going to talk about some of these things.
It was a very, very thoughtful question. I think the person took the time to try to make the point what they were interested in. I did a good job.
And it's very cogent in what they said and how they said it. I won't be able to ask all of it, but let me walk through a couple of sections. I see this as a three-part question, and we're going to start with the first question, which Bill O'Reilly was talking about the Johnson Amendment and our ability as a church to speak into political issues and how far we should be able to speak. So, a lot of churches, they sort of have some political biases that they try to sort of portray a certain side of politics through what they speak from the pulpit. There are some laws regarding that, and we'd like to talk a little bit about your thoughts on that, and how far should a church be able to go in influencing politics and being a part of the political arena, and what's a proper response for us in the church speaking into the world of politics?
Yeah, again, I thought that little thing by Bill O'Reilly, a helpful thing, give you ideas about things you've not heard about. I'd never heard of the Johnson Amendment before that. I did a little study on it and so forth. And it is, what happened was that in 1954, when Lyndon Johnson was a senator from Texas, he suggested an amendment to a tax bill, that prohibited 501k, tax exempt organizations, nonprofits, from endorsing or opposing particular political candidates or laws, overtly. Now, two things. One is you should know is that when it came up and was added to the tax code, it was not discussed, and there was no opposition to it. So it might have gone a little under the radar, at that point. Since then, there's been discussion and opposition of it, but it has never been repealed. It is part of the present tax code, this Johnson Amendment, which again, I was not aware of that before I heard about this with the question.
So what it says basically is there's a limit to what people can say from the pulpit, endorsing a political candidate or certain political views.
Or opposing them.
Yeah.
Now, here's the little aside, in a sense, context. 1954. So you might wonder what issues might have been in the forefront in Texas in 1954 that made you want to do that. I'm thinking civil rights issues, I think it was about personal and systemic racism issues, and perhaps maybe a way of trying to hold back a voice that was speaking for justice. And so you can see why people today might have opposition to something like that. They might say, hey, why do you want to quell the voice of people who want to speak, to issues of justice and fairness and what's right, and the way that, which I'm sympathetic to.
Sure.
But on the other hand, you'd have to say this. So, one of the things is that these organizations oftentimes are not regulated in the same way as other organizations are. And so you could easily see how one-sided contributions, for instance, could manipulate institutions to support or oppose a particular candidate, and could be overwhelming in that sense. By the way, it's not just churches; it's all kinds of nonprofit organizations. Protection for animals or whatever. This is the same organization.
Well, let me ask you something though with that. So, the church, obviously, we are a moral institution. So there are certain morals that that churches would hold to, and we're to speak the truth in love. Where is that distinction in the political realm then outside of the law? I mean, what would you see as being important for us to be able to, how do we speak to a culture that might not be seeing things from our morals?
Well, you got to remember that when the apostles were traveling around and the local authorities, the king at that point, told them to stop talking about what they were talking about. They said, "Hey, look, our primary responsibility is to God, and we can't stop, regardless of what the ramifications are going to be for us. We can't stop saying what we need to say to be able to do it." And I think Christians have a sense that and Americans have a sense that freedom of speech is about that. You can't prohibit somebody from saying what they think is important and speaking their conscience, on those issues. And again, I think you're right. I think the church has a responsibility at certain points to speak. Now, do they need to speak on every single issue and every single candidate and probably not. That's probably not the case. Maybe in the clearest of cases, it might become. Hey, by the way, no one has ever been there's never been any charges brought against anybody for the violation of the Johnson Amendment. So there's this, and President Trump recently has said that he would try to abolish it if he could. Now, you wonder, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Do you want nonprofit institutions that aren't regulated as to where all the money comes from and so forth to become, in a sense, super PACs for particular points of view? Because I'm sure we could come up with one that somebody would say, well, not that one, or not that one, So that's an issue. I think, on the one hand, I'd say, hey, we want to speak freely and with conscience and have the liberty to be able to do it. On the other hand, I'm not so sure that we want to become the point of the church is to be political at that point.
Yes.
Here's the second thing I'd say. We live in a highly polarized political culture right now in America, and it seems like to some degree we can hardly get anything done in Congress or through the government to some degree because people can't agree. Two opposite sides tend to be diametrically opposed to each other, and they tend to be moving further away.
Right.
And in their discussion of it, the rhetoric is so
volatile.
So inflammatory that it seems like you almost feel hopeless that you could ever come to.
I heard somebody once say, the opposite of pro is con, and so the opposite of progress would be Congress.
Yeah, that's good. But you think, hey, it's not that we want to simply say we want bipartisan thing. We want justice for people. We want correct decisions to be made. If one group holds it and the other, okay, well then the one that we think is right, we're before that, whichever one it is.
Well, let me push into that for a second because we have gotten into not only a polarization of parties that seem to hold more extreme views on either side, and sort of the extreme voices have become the loudest voices, and the median voices are a lot quieter. They're not as interesting for people in the media, I think. But there's a number of reasons for that happening, I think. But one question is, in Christianity today, there seems to be a strong alignment with the church with a particular political party. Now, it has not always been that party, incidentally, if you look historically at the church, but that's the case today. Do you think there's any dangers of the alignment of political party with the church itself?
Oh, no question about it. That in either way, in the sense, he says whatever party it is at that point, because as you said earlier, the church's job is to have a voice that we think is about accountability and moral authority and justice, and so the implication would be that if this institution is on your side, you must be right.
Yes.
And I think that's a dangerous situation to simply say, simply because this institution's on your side, you're right.
Well, I know Martin Luther made some real distinctions about the church and the state being able to wield the sword and be the arm of protection for the people. But the primary job of the church really is to present Jesus Christ and redemption, and what the story of redemption really is. And when there's an intermixing, he felt like things could really get ugly and volatile very fast.
Yeah, him being in Germany, there's the case. There's the
Yes.
You have the rise of Nazism in a certain sense, and if nothing else, the default approval of the church
Yes.
to be able to do it. And so you have very few people like Life Together guy. What's his name?
Bonhoeffer, yeah.
Yeah, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Thanks.
Yeah.
Who were, in a certain sense, brave enough to speak out against that, and you see what happened to them. They become a target of oppression from the regime because they counter the typical message.
And again, the church there looked very different, and looks currently very different, because it was a state-run church. So the state-run church had a head that was appointed by the government. In this case, it was the Nazi government, and Hitler was smart enough to put a Nazi in over them. So he essentially took over and usurped the authority of the church. So even Rome didn't quite have the authority over some of their people that they felt an allegiance to this guy that they'd put in power.
Here's the other thing I'd say, that in spite of the fact that we have this polarization, everybody seems to think that the issues are black and white. I think that the issues of public justice are very complex, very, very complex. And they're not getting any easier, they're getting more complex, you know. And so I would say it's probably, for Christians, okay, I would say that their responsibility is to be good citizens and to support and develop a perspective about what public life, just public life, ought to look like. I'm just not so sure that they need to have the church be the one that's trying to work out the subtle details of that. I think of an organization I support, the Center for Public Justice in Washington, D.C. And it's it's an evangelical think tank, so to speak, of Christians trying to figure out what does justice look like around the issues that are being discussed present day. And they're not right wing, left wing, kind of a thing. They are trying to say, hey, look, let's do our due diligence on seeing some of the complexity of these things and see where, as we're moving forward, what best seems to support that in terms of public policy. The dilemma is that even when that happens, you aren't guaranteed some sort of perfect public policy.
Sure.
So you could say, well, we're doing that, but we're not getting what we want always from it. Yeah, that's life right there. You can do what you think is the right thing, and it doesn't always turn out the way you want. But I do think Christians have that responsibility, and this is what I think is really great about this person's question, is that they have the responsibility to try to determine what does the kingdom of God mean to political life in the world, and how should we be involved in that faithfully as Christians.
And I think it's an important point that you make. I often say, if you look through the glasses of politics and you view your religion through politics, you will get a twisted view of what Christianity really is. If you look first through the Word of God in those glasses, and then you look at the world of politics, first of all, you'll see things on both sides of the fence that would agree and disagree with the Word of God. Right. And you realize that we're Christians first who serve our ultimate King, not just the King of this earth. First and foremost. All right, well, let me jump into the second question, because we spent some time on that. So this guy is going to be asking, about redistribution of wealth and how we should view our tax structure and the sort of chasm of difference between the very wealthy and the very poor, and how we should look as a country. Should we look as we've looked for years, or should that begin to change as this country changes? And let me read a part of this question. He had a couple of pages of question, but he said, a significant political message being presented by almost 100% of one of the party's major political candidates proclaims that everyone should receive everything at no cost, be it free medical care, free housing, free tuition, free border access, and free accountability from human moral responsibility, and all other free rides which I could list. So, what gives with respect to how our Christian faith views this development, and does the Christian message subscribe to a precept that everyone deserves everything by definition because we're all God's children. So how would you tackle that? What would you say? And the basic idea is this, that there are some who say, shouldn't we all enjoy the monetary benefits of the society that we're in? There shouldn't be poor, there shouldn't be people who are in need because there's people who are very wealthy, and shouldn't we be able to distribute that and share it? And that's a common message that we hear today in some political arenas.
Yeah, and his description of it is the description of the way in which the dialogue's been polarized.
Yes.
You can see it's the free everything versus personal accountability, or
right?
Something, and that's the way it appears. And by the way, I think that's the way people play it. Even the politicians play it because they think it's easier to sell somebody on that, or as you said, it's better entertainment to sell it that way.
Right.
Well, here's a couple things. One is, I would say we were talking about that quote by Winston Churchill that democracy was the worst type of government except for all the rest. And someone else asked, could you say the same thing about capitalism?
Right.
And that might be the case. If you really were trying to say, hey, we should have a communist, not just socialist, but move beyond that to, in a certain sense, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, total redistribution of wealth.
Yes.
Well, that experiment has already failed.
Sure.
So you don't need to know whether that's a good idea.
Yeah,
or
we
not.
had 80 years of that experiment.
And it did not go well. It
Right.
did not go. But now you see, in a certain sense, in the very place where it didn't go well, they have, to some degree, modified it in a more free market of it. It doesn't seem to be going real well there. There's a lot of brokenness and a lot of, stuff going on there that you wouldn't want. I think that what we're talking about is we're talking about people being responsible, but at the same time recognizing that there are great needs of people in the world that you want to address. If you're just going to focus it on that issue about giving people things, if it's just about taking care of people who don't have. Now, should people be held responsible to some degree for the things that they're giving? Sure, in the New Testament, when people weren't working because they decided that Christ was going to return the next day, the apostles told them, hey, if they don't work, don't let them eat.
They don't eat. Yeah.
He was trying to say, hey, motivate them to take responsibility, in a right way for where we're at right now and so forth. And I think we can demand that of people, that they be responsible.
Yes.
But the reality is that some people have great needs, and we got to figure out how to meet those needs. That, as Christians, that's our job, to love people.
So let me ask you something. So in the Acts 2 church, for instance, it said that those who had wealth, if they had a field or something like that, if they saw people in need, they would sell what they had and they would share it with others.
Right.
So is that what our responsibility is? And to this question, as a society, is that what we should do, not just with the church?
Well, let's make the distinction between the church and the state. Okay? The church and the state are two different things. Okay? And in the book of Acts, that idea of holding all things in common, of living in community. And by the way, we have today Christian communities that live in that way, where they live in a place where they hold all things in common, and there's no personal property, and that kind of thing. I don't think that's a mandate of the Bible. I think it's an option, though. If Christians decide that they want to live in that context, I think it's legitimate for them to say, I want to live in that context. I don't think it's legitimate to demand that of the state, when you could say, well, why are we doing? Well, they're doing that for another reason, because of the church. They're doing that, they're trying to show their love for their brothers and sisters in Christ in a way that is, that is self-sacrificial and meets the demand of the need that they have and so forth. But I think the Bible's always leaned on that side. You think back in the book of Leviticus, that one of the things about in Leviticus 23 about the fields being reaping of the fields, they said always leave the outside of the field reaped, or whatever you call it. And the reason was because you needed to supply food for people who were in need. And by the way, when it says who's in need, it says the poor, the alien, and the person who's like the temporary resident.
Right, and we
You know?
have a really good example of that with the book of Ruth. I mean, when Ruth came back, her mother-in-law lost her husband, and the girls lost their husbands, and they were basically women who were all alone in a very difficult society to be a single woman in. And they went back to Israel, and they were able to glean from those fields. You know, so I
Right.
mean, you can see how that was a safety net for people
Right.
in that time.
You know, and I would say this. I would say, hey, sure, the state has a certain responsibility to help meet people's needs, but at the same time, the church has a responsibility too to meet people's needs. How's the church doing on that? And this is where I'm thrown back to in Leviticus 25 about the year of Jubilee, you know, and canceling of debts, and, you know, taking a couple of years off from growing stuff and so. And the Bible is honest enough to say, for God to say this: I know what you're thinking when I ask you to do these things. I know what you're thinking is you're thinking, hey, a brother's going to come to you who needs some money, and you're going to say, hey, it's 2 years before the year of Jubilee where the debts are all going to be canceled. If I give him money, I'm never going to get it back. You know?
If your credit card company said this December we're going to cancel all debts, most people would run up their credit cards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're thinking, oh man, this is unbelievable. I'm not. And so as a result, what does God say? He says, look, don't be tight-fisted. Don't be hard-hearted. Be open-handed. Love people the way that I've loved you in an unconditional way. That sounds very different than, you know, make everybody earn their keep or they don't get what they need.
Okay, so if I hear what you're saying, the church then should care for the poor, and it should, in a sense, redistribute wealth. If there are people who have and there are people who have not, the people who have should help out. How would this play then into us interacting with politics? Is that a right view for us to keep, or in this day
Well,
and age,
here's
is
what
it
I would
not?
say. I would say as Christians, it's not simply the church that has to do it. You know, this is where the individualistic notion of the gospel versus a kingdom perspective makes a difference. When you realize that the kingdom perspective includes all various spheres of life, and Christians are involved in these various spheres, all of them have to say, how do we take responsibility for justice in our sphere of life to be worked out? So in business, I might say, hey, I got to figure out how businesses can be reorganized in a way, and how I can encourage new business entrepreneurially and so to provide poor people opportunities. I want to think of new ways to do education to be able to make sure that people aren't in some cycle of poverty. And so I want to figure out about how to do housing. So it's
Yes.
not just the government. It's not just the church. It's Christians in all these different spheres of life. We don't have that right now. We don't have that kind of full-orbed approach to things. Hey, by the way, back in the time of the year of Jubilee, you mentioned this too, we were talking earlier, back in the time of the year of Jubilee where all these things were supposed to take place, where, you know, land got its rest and people got debts forgiven and got reenfranchised into the culture, the people of God never once ever, you know, observed the year of Jubilee.
Right.
Which makes you think we tend to be selfish, you know. What we need is God to come change our hearts. We need to have that, you know, that tight-fisted hard-heartedness, you know, spoken to us about love, and let us be able to, you know, meet people's needs.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, the Bible talks about a lot of moral issues, and a lot of times the church will tout those moral issues, but oftentimes in those same lists, you'll see greed as one of the moral issues that's in there. So, well, that's a good word. Well, thank you, Dr. Terry Thomas, for being a part of this episode of Ask a Pastor. As always, if you have any questions, we would love to answer those questions. You can send them in on our website to Ask a Pastor, and we look forward to being with you next time.